Very happy to say that Chief Maracle is here with us today. Before we start, I'm just going to make a few announcements and let you know a little bit more about the Heritage Hour series. So yeah, welcome to our second Heritage Hour talk of 2023. We really appreciate you all joining us here today. I've seen some returning faces and some new faces as well. I'm Turner Douglas, Program Coordinator with the Department of Heritage Services. And before we move any further, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The City of Kingston acknowledges that we are on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, and thanks these nations for their care and stewardship over this shared land. For those of you who are new to Heritage Hour, this is a bi-monthly series which focuses on different aspects of local history and culture. Talks run approximately an hour, and then there will be some time for questions at the end, hopefully. Most talks are filmed and uploaded to YouTube, and we have our wonderful communications team with us here today with a camera at the front. So if you would like to avoid being on video, just avoid walking across the front here. So before we introduce Chief Maracle, I have two announcements. Firstly, we are recruiting volunteers with a love of local history to lead tours in City Hall. And if you would like to learn more, we have some leaflets by the back door, which you can pick up on your way out after the talk. And then secondly, we have two upcoming exhibitions. The first is 36 Questions That Lead to Loving Kingston, which will be opening in the Market Wing at City Hall on July 4th. And the second is The Art of Survival, which will be a showcasing of artwork created by members of the Prison for Women Memorial Collective. That will be also opening on July 4th at the Pump House Museum. So yes, I will now welcome Kevin to the stage to introduce Chief Maracle to you and tell you a bit more about it.
Thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Kevin Gibbs. I'm the Acting Director of Heritage Services. If you haven't met me yet, it's great to meet you all, at least from this vantage point. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Chief R. Donald Maracle of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte to our second Heritage Hour talk of 2023 in acknowledging June is National Indigenous History Month. Chief Maracle served as Chief of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte for over 30 years and as Councillor for 12 years before that. In his over 4 decades of leading and guiding the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, Chief Maracle has accomplished many things. If I were to go into any level of detail about these things, it would take up the entire hour and more, so I'll just mention a few of his many contributions. He's overseen the regeneration of his nation's land base, installation of a new energy infrastructure, construction of a water treatment plant and expansion of the water delivery system, renewal of the roads network, expansion of housing stock, completion of a new police building, administrative building, and restoration of Her Majesty's Chapel Royal of the Mohawks. And his advocacy goes beyond his own community. He's worked on projects with the Chiefs of Ontario, the Iroquois Caucus, the AI Chiefs Council, and many more. At the City of Kingston, Chief Maracle was a member of the Sir John A. Macdonald Working Group, playing a role in the ongoing recontextualization of the narrative of Canada's first Prime Minister, where he contributed his insights and understanding of many topics, including his extensive knowledge of the history of the Mohawk peoples and the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte, which is what he will be speaking about today. So please join me in welcoming Chief Donald Maracle.
Sego so bueno. If some of the people that are at the back would like to come to a bit closer to the front, that would be great. So I'm sure that all of you have heard about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to reconcile the wrongs that have been done to our nation in the colonial history of this country. And one of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommended was that Canadians should have a better understanding of the history of this country, and in particular its relationship and interaction with the original people of the land, you would call them Aboriginal, but we had nations. There were Canada, and the Royal Proclamation of 1763 said that to the Crown and the nations in which we are connected. And so we are a nation of people because we have our own history in this land. We have our own culture, our own way of life, our own languages, and our own spirituality. All things that qualify to make us a distinct nation. Canadians, however, their nationhood is rooted in other countries. Their languages, their spirituality, whether it's Christian, it's rooted in countries across the ocean. Oftentimes their system of governments were influenced and modeled by other systems that were in Europe, particularly in this country with the monarchy and in our society, women in particular always had a civil voice. Women were not silenced to obey their husbands or didn't have democratic rights. Women often selected who the chief would be to represent their clans. Before contact with Jacques Cartier's group and before Columbus came in 1492 to South America, we had there was a warring faction actually of 5 nations, and they didn't have peace, and they didn't know how to make peace among themselves. So there was a prophet by the name of Tyendinaga and Hiawatha that came to the warring factions in the upper New York State area and some in this part of the country to make peace. And they thought that the message was that when people live peacefully with one another, they can achieve a lot and accomplish a lot more by cooperating, by respecting each other's likes and things that made them different. But everything could be tolerated, and it would be better for people to work together. So they agreed to bury their weapons of war symbolically under a pine tree. And it was said that this pine tree was to grow in the 4 directions of the earth, the great white roots of peace. And it was inviting all of the nations to take their shelter under the protection of the Creator and under the great law of peace. They always believed that our way shall be the way of reason, righteousness, and peace. That dialogue was necessary to settle differences rather than warfare or quarrels or hatred. That was nothing good could come from that. So oftentimes they had to have long council meetings of the 50 chiefs so they could come to a consensus about what to do with an issue that they were facing. We were represented by 3 clans in that system of government. The Mohawk people, there were 50 chiefs, each representing clans. The Mohawk people had 9 chiefs representing the turtle, bear, and wolf. Ranatayuni is what is the wolf clan, which I'm a wolf clan chief. So the women's role was to nurture the children, to instill in them the Scotni Gondrio, which is the good mind. The good mind would govern the heart and the spirit of the people. So it was important not just for the women, but the grandmothers, the aunties, and all the other women and the children of the village to nurture the children's minds so that they would have respect for the things that are in nature, to not kill animals for the sake of killing, but if you're going to consume them, and to always think of leaving some for the 7 generations of unborn that were coming toward us. So they respected the laws of nature. They respected the goodness and grace of Sumboyadism, which you'd call him God, who created all these things to help sustain us in this life. And when there were quarrels, it was important that not be left unaddressed. So we had sacred plants that we had used in our ceremonies. Whenever we had a gathering, people in the gathering of the minds had to come first. The Hondo Garawatego, which we will bring our minds together as one. And that set the tone for the meeting when all the things that we should be thankful for, and the tobacco was burned as an act of thanksgiving. So the smoke from the tobacco would rise to the Creator, and he would know that the people were still thankful for all the things in creation that sustain us in this life. If there was sickness in the village, they would burn sage as a healing for the prayer for the people. Much the same way that Christians and Catholics in particular burn incense in their churches as a spiritual plant. Then if there were quarrels, they would use sweetgrass to purify the mind from differences. So everybody that was sincere and loved peace and knew the importance of having peace and good relationships, would smudge themselves before the dialogue would start. The prayers would be said that the Creator would help them in their journey to reconcile their differences. So they would smudge themselves as a symbolic gesture of their sincerity, that they were there to work for peace and to love and respect the people that were in their villages and that they came into contact with. However, in 1492, Columbus came, and despite the first treaty that was made with the indigenous people in Brazil, what is now Brazil, the treaty was signed to have peace and friendship, and it was violated very quickly after then. We all know about the Spanish and the plundering for gold and the hostility and brutality that the people suffered there in the conquest of imperialism and to make the European countries more richer by plundering the gold from other nations. And then in 1534, Jacques Cartier, a French explorer, came down the St. Lawrence River to a place called Stadacona, which is now Quebec City, and met the St. Lawrence Iroquois people. And so they said, "Guts ne ganada, guts ne ganada, come to the village." And so that's where this country gets its name from. It was originally thought that maybe they came from the Spanish word ganada, but the Spaniards were never ever in this part of the country looking for gold, so it was meant they were the invitation to the village site. And the Heritage skits, there was a skit put out about that meeting that took place many years ago. So we're soon be coming up to the 500th anniversary of that historic meeting. So then a year later, he went to Hochelaga and met more St. Lawrence Iroquois people. And the Hurons were there as well, and of course their language is the same as ours, but they were an outcast group from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We don't know why, but they were, but their language and their ceremonies are the same as ours. So in 1608, Samuel Champlain came to, again, Stadacona, and decided that was the best fur trade area in the country, and established the French city there, or a town there, settlement there, I guess is a better word at the time, for the French people to engage in the fur trade. Soon after, Jesuit priests came. But one thing that happened, our people became known for savagery. And when the priests would come to have the Christian service, what they would notice is that there would be a great sickness would fall on the people and many would die. And so they felt when he was conducting the sacrament that he was casting some kind of evil spell on the people, because when he left, a lot of people would fall sick and many would die. And the reason for that was because when the Europeans came, our people didn't have any natural immunity to the diseases that they brought with them, with the influenza, smallpox, STD, other diseases. We had no natural immunity because we didn't have those diseases before Europeans came. And so they burned Father Brebeuf in 1649 because of the sickness that he brought after he left. So for that, then the French people thought our people were savage. But I don't think people understood a lot about communicable diseases at the time. But as a result of contact with Europeans, 90% of the original indigenous people on this continent, both here and in South America, died just from contact alone. So while the fur trade flourished, Jesuit priests and French explorers went further inland and met new indigenous people. It was the Indians who guided their canoes in the portages to the fur trade, to support the fur trade, which was the backbone of the first economy in this country. And so you'll notice the nickel, the Canadian coin, the nickel has the beaver on it, is because of that history. So while the fur trades flourished, so did disease spread in contact. And of course, then there was a new group that emerged called the Métis, as some of the French fur traders intermingled with the indigenous women of the different nations, and there was a new group of people called the Métis emerged. Oftentimes they were absorbed by the Indian villages in which they lived, as long as they abided by the customs and cultural practices of the people. So, well, the fur trade flourished by the late, so in 1664, there was a lot of imperial ambitions by both the Dutch and the English and the French nations. In 1613, we had made the first treaty with the Dutch to have peace and friendship and trade with the Dutch newcomers. Similar arrangements were made with other nations, with the French, and then eventually we had the same thing with the English. So the struggle that happened was in 1664, the Dutch were defeated by the English. So in 1677, our ancestors entered into the Silver Covenant chain of friendship with the English. In that we would have peace, we would have friendship, we would have trade, but if there was a war, our ancestors would be allies of the English king or queen. And so that was the arrangement in 1677. It still is recognized by the British royal family today. So that Silver Covenant chain did bring our people into many wars. In the late 1600s, the French started to build forts in the upper Great Lakes area. One was Fort Frontenac, which is here, then Fort Niagara, which is on the American side of Niagara Falls now. And with the building of those forts, and as both the nations, English and French, were emerging to become engaged in a colossal struggle for imperial supremacy, both wanted strong military alliances with other indigenous nations. So the Hurons and the Algonquins largely aligned themselves with the French, while the Haudenosaunee aligned themselves with the English through those alliances. So with the building of these forts, there was a lot of worry that, if there was ever a war, that these forts would be used to attack the 13 colonies. So the English colonial leaders were quite concerned about the imperial ambitions and the potential for warfare. And in the 1700s, the King of Spain died, leaving no heir to the throne. The French wanted a certain person on that throne, a Catholic king, and England, those European countries couldn't agree who would take the Spanish throne. So the War of the Spanish Succession broke out. Whenever there was war between France and England, there was also heightened worry and hostility in their respective colonies here in North America. The 13 colonies were English along the Atlantic seaboard, of course, in the St. Lawrence River area were the French. So with this heightened tension, the colonial governors decided it would be best to strengthen the covenant chain. So what was the covenant chain and the treaty, the two-row wampum treaty, basically said the English will sail down the River of Life in their ship, and we will sail down the River of Life in our canoe, but we won't steer each other's ships or interfere with the governance of each other's people. And so that was a long-standing view held particularly by our Algonquins tradition. So with imperial ambitions on the rise, the colonial governors decided to take 4 ordinary men to England to meet with Queen Anne at St. James's Palace to strengthen this military alliances, because by 1700 there were also grievances that the Haudenosaunee and other nations had, particularly with the use of alcohol to gain access to land, and there were a lot of land frauds and abuses that occurred. So the purpose of the trip to England was to polish the chain, but to get a renewed sense of alliance that the Haudenosaunee could depend on the English. So in April of 1710, 5 set out from our nation. They weren't chiefs, they weren't longhouse chiefs, they were ordinary men who were willing to take the trip. But the English hailed them when they arrived in London as kings. The royal carriages were brought out, and they were taken to the St. James's Palace, which was the official royal residence at the time. and they had an audience with Queen Anne. And because the French had been putting Jesuit priests and Sulpician priests in the villages to basically not only convert to Christianity, but one of their primary purposes was also to court favor toward their respective king and their political views of how things should be done. So they were also diplomats as well as priests and ambassadors for their respective king, and oftentimes their appointment would be kept as long as they did a good job with that role. And so the English wanted to emulate the same policy of the French, so at first they wanted to do the same thing, to have priests, Church of England priests in the villages to convert to Christianity, but also to court the favor of the people toward their respective king. So that was their role. And so first the New England Company sent, which was a royal organization established to promote the gospel in foreign parts. And so they sent a priest by the name of Thurgood Moore to the Mohawk village. Now, when outsiders came to the village, they didn't just come up and say, "Here I am, see me." They waited at the edge of the woods with diplomacy, and then to see if they would be welcome to come to the village. And so, because there had been land frauds and abuses and unsettled grievances, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy began to doubt whether or not they could depend on what they were being told, and whether or not the king was able to control their own citizens. And so, they did not receive Thurgood Moore in 1702, so they waited. And so there had been other talks held, and then by 1710 they decided that they would accept the king's clergy to the villages, and that the covenant chain would be polished to remove the stains so that these abuses, land frauds and abuses, would not continue, that they would have a peace and friendship, but honest dealings with each other. And so the visit happened, and they were showing all of the Navy and the Great Might of Britain, because it ruled the seas at the time. They went to hear Shakespeare, they seen the horses and the ladies, but one thing they did notice was the drastic difference in quality of life and poverty that some of the people had in England, where in our society everybody would be the same. They would all share. There was more of a sharing concept. A hunter didn't provide just for their immediate family, they provided for the village. The fishing group provided for the village. The women looked after all of the children. And so there was a strong sense of family for all the people that were in the village. But the English society wasn't like that. So part of our history is connected to this place, particularly at Fort Frontenac. There was a Cuba settlement around that fort for a while, but they came here to trade when they had more friendly relationships with the French. And but anyway, so once again, this imperial ambition became real just before the French-Indian Wars in 1754 to 1759. And that was really a war over who was going to get control of monopoly on the fur trade. So the English wanted a monopoly on the fur trade. In the 1640s, there had been Indian warfare over the fur trade, because as the furs got hunted out and tapped out in the areas, they went further abroad to expand their hunting territory. So that it brought about warfare among our people. And in these French-Indian Wars, of course, we aligned ourselves, honored our covenant chain of 1677 with the English, and the French were defeated. The main battle was led by Sir William Johnson at Niagara. Niagara was the main trading post that brought the most economic wealth to the French at the time. And so with the loss of that strategic fort, the French king decided in 1759, in July the 8th, 1759, there was no longer any economic wealth-gaining reason for the French to resolve to continue that fight. And it was costing their French king a lot of money to continue that fight, so they abandoned the will to fight. And so there was a day-and-a-half skirmish at the Plains of Abraham in Quebec in September 1759. And then the French surrendered to the British. One of our chiefs, Captain John de Zaranto, was there during the capitulation of the French at Montreal. The French were allowed to keep the Catholic faith. They were allowed to keep their Napoleonic system of government, but they had to pledge loyalty to the English king or be deported to France or to Louisiana in the Florida area. So that's what happened to them. So 1763, the First Treaty of Paris was signed with ending the war with the French. And also in 1763, there were still these continuing land fraud issues going on and grievances of the Haudenosaunee people and other nations to the English king and their governors. So on October the 7th, 1763, a royal proclamation was issued in the name of King George III. And it acknowledged that there had been great land frauds and abuses committed. And so the colonial settlers no longer could have direct dealings with the indigenous people concerning getting acquisition to land. It had to be an officer of the Crown to have land dealings. There had to be, the Crown officer had to call a public meeting for that purpose, and there had to be consent. Some safeguard and rules are put in place for this settling of land. So anyway, that royal proclamation is one of the constitutional documents in Canada's constitution today. In 1982, when Canada wanted to repatriate the constitution from the British Parliament so they could amend the constitution of this country without having to get consent from the English Parliament, the chiefs did lobby to make sure that the royal proclamation was going to be part of the constitutional documents of Canada. So that was accommodated, and the Aboriginal treaty rights of our people were affirmed and recognized. So more trouble came in the 1770s, which culminated in the American Revolution. The colonial settlers didn't like paying taxes to the British Parliament without having any representation there. There was the Stamp Tax Act that they didn't like. But they did not like the Royal Proclamation of 1763 because no longer could they use alcohol to deprive the Aboriginal people of their land and commit these abuses with no punishment. And so all of this tension broke out, and it culminated in the American Revolution. So by 1777, our homeland had become a place of much tension in the upper New York State where our villages were. Our hunting villages were on the north shore of Lake Ontario, and our fishing villages. As a matter of fact, there's a fishing village in what called the Bath Road there on Lake Ontario. There's a big monument there that was put up by the Ministry of Transport acknowledging that. So with this tension, in October 1777, Captain John de Zaranto decided to take the people of our village to Lachine, where they encamped during the American Revolution. And they provided, they led forays on behalf of the warriors, led forays into the Mohawk Valley. They fought at Oriskany, and the women and children were sheltered at Lachine while the warriors fought on the side of the king. And likewise with Joseph Brandt's group, who took his people to Niagara. There they encamped around Fort Niagara. But there were hard times during that time. There was death, and disease, and hunger in this military alliance. Our homes were burned to the ground by the Americans. Our chapel, the first chapel royal of the Mohawks, was desecrated and used as a tavern at first by the American rebels, and then later an animal shelter. So if I could have someone come up and these, when the chiefs had accepted the silver, accepted to allow the Queen to build a chapel near our fort. We are the 400 Mohawks. The chapel is inside of the fort, she presented a double communion set and a Bible. The Bible in the other part of the cremations, because Captain Joseph Brant wanted royal decorations for his chapel. So this, you can hold the other pattern, and there's the flag in the pattern. So in the left hand, you hold the small dish. It's a pattern, I guess you'd call it the bread dish in communion if you don't know the religious symbols. It's a pattern. This is the flag, and it holds the wine during communion. And it reads here, the gift of Her Majesty Anne of Great Britain, Ireland and France, and of her plantations in North America, Queen Her Indian Chapel of Mohawks. It's Anne Regina, and the crest on it is the Order of the Garter. So those are very important societies in the British. So this silver is regarded as some of the most valuable historic silver in this country. So when the chiefs were there in 1710, Queen Anne had her painter, Jan Morel's paint their portraits, which hung for many years at Kensington Palace. And in 1977, the Canadian government retrieved those paintings, probably from a private collection at that time, and they are now in the public archives on Wellington Street in Ottawa. In October 1977, when they were brought to Canada, the Queen and Prince Philip came to unveil those paintings at Wellington Street in Ottawa. So with the American Revolution, it was a time of turmoil, a time of much hardship, but the alliance did not fail. Our people fought on the side of the king, and I often think if the generals that were running the military operations, if they had listened to John Toronto and Captain John Joseph Brant, they wouldn't have lost the war. They were not very strategic in their decision-making, particularly Butler's Rangers. But the culmination of all that was the 1783 Treaty of Paris was signed to bring peace between the United States, new United States Congress, and the British Crown. There was no provision for any of our people to regain our homeland. And so the governor asked our people to select new territory on the North Shore, so in our traditional hunting grounds. And so in April 1st, 1793, 97,000 acres was set aside, which was originally all of Tyendinaga Township, as the new settlement for the Mohawk allies of the Crown. But shortly after, once again, the king couldn't control their subjects. More people came and started to squat on that land that was set aside for our people. And again, the Indian agent started to sell land to the settlers that were coming there. Some of them paid for it and some of them didn't. There were installments made, and quite a bit of it was never paid for. But the most important thing, there was never any consent of our people to part with any of our land. The people just came there and squatted there. And so this gives rise to land claims. Oftentimes the Crown agents, in order to keep their appointment, they had to bring back what the ultimate goal of the government was a surrender. And so oftentimes the documents were fraudulent. And so there are many cases now that are going before the courts where these documents are being exposed as being fraudulent because the people that were doing that business wanted to keep their job. So these unscrupulous measures were implemented at times. So this is why we still have outstanding grievances concerning what happened to our land. So our people had been encamped at Lachine for 7 years, and so when John de Toronto selected the Bay of Quinte to be far away from the Americans, Captain Joseph Brant didn't want to settle there. It was the hope of the Crown that all the Mohawks would settle in one place, but he decided that the upper Mohawks from Ganat-Johare would settle at the Grand River, and our Mohawks from Ticonderoga would settle at the Bay of Quinte, so that was the final outcome. So we were regarded at that time because there was an enemy on the horizon of the new American state. As long as there was an enemy on the horizon, we were seen to be invaluable allies on the ground. We were respected. Our military contributions were valued. And once again, they were called to take up arms, so as the British would say, take up the hatchet in the name of the king during the War of 1812. And because once again, there was another war going on between England and France, Napoleon's War, our people were called to arms here in the War of 1812. And so Sir Isaac Brock needed allies, particularly because the British government couldn't send a lot of soldiers. So they had to turn to the French voltigeurs, but they had to turn to the Indians to help them. And so there was Tecumseh's Delaware warriors that helped. There was Captain John Brant, and Captain John Norton that helped the British, particularly at Niagara. And so at Kingston Heights and the War of the Beaver Dams and the Belfemi, our people fought there, and also at Crosby. Some went there. Gola Brant went there to fight, but most of them went to Six Nations to fight with their other relatives that were there. And so without the help of the Indians, there may have never ever been a country called Canada. We would be American citizens, and this would likely be an American state, and history would evolve in a much different fashion to what you know. Your rights would be different, and the outcome could only be speculated, but there was that enemy on the horizon. But what happened in colonial history was after there was no longer an enemy on the horizon, the policy toward our people changed by the colonial government. We are now in the way of progress. The government wanted to assimilate. The government wanted to settle our people on reserves so they could open up the country for more immigration from their countries in Europe. They were losing sight of the promises they made, the treaties that were made, and the understanding with our people. In 1830, residential schools were built. There was 150,000 people taken from their children, taken from their communities to go to residential schools. Only a few of the reserves had schools. And it was really an assimilation camp. They were not allowed to speak their languages, practice their religion. They had to cut their hair to make them look European. They had to dress the way Europeans, and they had to adopt the values. And anything about their identity that came from our nationhood was seen to be not acceptable and inferior to European society. So much abuse occurred in the residential schools. This went on from 1830 until 1969 was the last one. No, 1996 was the last one that closed. The Mohawk Institute, which ran the longest from 1830 to 1969. My grandfather and his sister went to that residential school from 1896 until 1900. I'd like you to come over. I'd like you to read something if you would. Square. This is an example of what most Canadians do not know. By the way, one of the most famous runners in Tom Longwood also attended the Mohawk Residential School as well. We just read that and then just get scrolled down to it. So the OPP are currently conducting investigations now into a number of children who died at the residential schools to see if there's any criminality involved in their deaths. Because they were young people that died. They were children. And so when Nicole Scotty from the OPP, the detective, called me because I asked him, our mother told us about our grandfather and his sister dying there. We knew that, but we didn't know anything else. So I wanted to know more information about it. Now Now, mind you, you have to look at this because there were no antibiotics until 1948. So if people got sick, there was a high probability they might die from influenza. But there was also tuberculosis running rampant in those schools because there was so much overcrowding. They were underfunded by both the churches and the federal government, so the nutrition was questionable. One of the elders in our community, Wilbur Maracle, went there because the Indian agents said they could get a better education there than they could on the reserve. That was the reason why my grandfather case was because my great-grandfather had been killed by a train. They were going to get grain for their farm animals, and him and his brother, the horses were spooked by the train, and it pulled them right into the train, and they were killed. So my grandfather was orphaned at 7 years old, and my great-grandmother had 8 children, 1 a week old. So the younger ones were taken to the residential school, presumably because to get a better education, and they could get on the reserve, but also she was losing her eyesight, so she probably had diabetes and had complications of going with blindness from it. There was no help to assist the widows on the reserve other than what their neighbors would share with them or their other family members, and so they went there in August of 1896, when my grandfather was 11 and 10 years old, and my great-aunt would have been 11 years old. So we read that. So I wanted to make sure it was our family, first of all, with this Jenny Maracle I found, so I did ask some questions. If you could read that.
Good afternoon, Chief Don. Below is the information in response to your questions regarding Jenny Jane Maracle. 1. Peter B. Maracle and Sarah Maracle, a clause. 2. Census documents for 1891 list Jenny Maracle as being 7 years old. An exact date of birth is not known. Jenny Maracle died August 16, 1900 from complications related to heart disease. Jenny Maracle is buried at the Mohawk Chapel, and the exact grave site is unknown. It is unknown if there was a funeral for Jenny Maracle, and if so, who it was conducted by. The obituaries in the local newspaper state she was laid to rest.
That's the obituary.
The obituaries here. At Mohawk Institute this morning, Jenny Maracle, an inmate, passed away. Deceased has been suffering with the disease of the heart for the last 4 months, which ran into a complication bringing the end. The remains will be laid to rest tonight. And that's the obituary from the time.
So before they could even send a telegram to the Indian agent in Toronto to let my great-grandmother know her daughter had died, they had already decided to bury her at night at the Mohawk Chapel at Six Nations. That happened a lot of times. What other school in this country would the students who go there, would they have a graveyard and the students be digging graves for their classmates? Where else did that happen in this country? That's what happened to our people. So my grandfather was very angry and upset about something. And my mom always said she thinks it was the way they were treated at the residential school. Now, mind you, they weren't all bad. There are stories where some of the people were kind to them. There were letters of complaint from some of them, were decent staff to the Minister of Indian Affairs, pointing out, how wrong things were that they witnessed in these schools. So they weren't all bad. But the problem was there was no corrective action taken to resolve it. It just continued, decade after decade. So they didn't have enough to eat, so the children in these schools went to school for half a day. Then the other part of the day, they were looking after the farm, tending to the farm animals or the gardens. And then there were people from the neighboring farms to the Mohawk Institute, other non-native farmers, would come and take the boys from the school to farm their property. So in a sense, it was a form of free child labor. And so this is what went on. As a matter of fact, the one administrator of the school that had a farm had the boys working his farm just as much as they were working the residential school farm. And that, so the cream and vegetables were sold, and that provided some of the money to run the school. And so the administrator, when he was caught with this scandal, and he was fired from his job. If the boys didn't get enough to eat, they'd go to the apple orchard and pick an apple or pull something up out of the ground that was growing and eat it. They would be horsewhipped if they did that. In the 1940s, Canada conducted nutrition experiments to see if children could flourish on 1,000 calories a day. That is no diet for a developing child. That's part of the history of our country. So the children there were used as guinea pigs in those experiments. So, but also in the last century, war broke out once again, and our people were called to take up the hatchet for the cause of the king. So, in the First World War, there was about 4,000 Indians volunteered their time to serve in the war. They could not be conscripted into the army because they didn't have a franchise. They could not vote. So they were not allowed. So they had to volunteer their services. Oftentimes, what they did, they had to hide their race to say they were Italian, or they were Spanish, or they were something but not an Indian in different places. And the sad thing about it is, and likewise in the Second World War, with the Korean War and the Afghanistan War, and also in the United States, many of our people fought in the Vietnam War as well. So some of the most decorated soldiers in this country are Indians. They're going to make, I think it's a coin or $1 for Tommy Prince. And so Colonel Thomas Gilday, he was from the Broken Head Reserve in Manitoba. When he died there, they thought, oh, well, that's just another drunken Indian, another no-good Indian that's there. But when they did research in his background, they found out that he had helped liberate Rome during the Second World War with the Devil's Brigade, under the command of Colonel Thomas Gilday. So I met Colonel Thomas Gilday at the Military Institute in Toronto, and we had some lunch with him, and he said, I want to let you know that the Indians never had their proper recognition for their service. And he said, could I come to your community sometime and talk about it? I said, you can. We're going to have Mohawk Landing Day. And so he wasn't well, but one of the lawyers there in Toronto broke him down, and he brought the sword that King George III gave to Captain Joseph Brant for his loyalty. And he talked about what it was like when they liberated Rome. He said that when the communication system broke down, they needed somebody to go and repair the communication lines. Colonel Tommy Gilday's skin was the right color. They couldn't mistake him as an Italian because he was darker. So when he went out to fix the lines, the German soldiers were right in sight. They thought he was just an Italian worker. If they would have sent somebody that was pale, it would have been a dead green giveaway. But the other thing in the Second World War is that the military in the South Pacific were using native languages, code talkers, because the British could not decode our language. So the very language that they were strapping their children and grandchildren in their day schools and the residential schools was exactly the same language that they were using in their military communications to save the people that were at war. There is the irony and the contradiction of the whole thing, and the injustice of the whole thing. So back in a few years ago, the last Mohawk code talker, Levi Oakes from Akwesasne, was taken to he came to the AFN meeting. There was a point for him to come to the chambers in the House of Commons, and he got a standing ovation for that role. We had Mohawk code talkers from our reserve, but they had all passed on. But they used the Cherokee language, the Mohawk language, other indigenous languages in military communications. But after the war was over, the same policy of assimilation continued, the same attitude that these languages were inferior, because the Canadians were never told that's what happened. In the schools, the Canadians were never told about our history, what happened. Why? Because they like to call our history that there were these pioneers who came, they toiled, they cleared the land and toiled this hill, and they worked hard to get ahead. But there was more to the story than that. Our people's vision was that we would be good friends to each other. We would help each other in times of need. We would be your ally in times of war, but there would be honesty in our dealings with each other. However, colonialism brought to our people oppression and racism, a dispossession of our land, and poverty, and suicide, and all of the combination of all that brought about many addictions. The alcohol that was brought to defraud our people of our land, many people develop alcoholism. Everything we've had to get in this country, we've had to fight for. Why should we have to fight? We are the original people of this land. We agreed to share our land with the newcomers. The land and resources are the foundation of the economic prosperity of this country. Without the land, without the resources, what kind of economy would there be for people to participate and work and to better themselves? But our value system was different. After the Protestant Reformation, before that, most of the land was controlled by the clergy and the church, and the wealth amassed to the church, and maybe a few others that were the priests and administrators of the church. But the Protestant Reformation brought about individual and civil rights, opportunity for more education, but opportunity for people to become wealthier. And so individual capitalism emerged as a value of European society, the accumulation of individual wealth. But in our society, the well-being of the village mattered the most. And that was one of the fundamental differences that emerged when Europeans started coming to this country, and both here in North America and South America. So really the challenge that we face today is that as Canadians need to learn more about their history, they need to become true partners in reconciliation with the original people of the land. And I think it's the honorable and just thing to do. The Queen always wanted reconciliation, Queen Elizabeth II. So in 2019, to honor, because 213 of our community served in the Second World War, if you would come and hold up the prayer book there. One other more, the prayer book. This one? Yeah. Take that around to show them. That is the personal prayer book of King George VI, which Queen Elizabeth sent over with the Canadian military officials. General de Chaplin came to present that on behalf of the Queen. It has the King's crest on it. And so the Queen recognizes the contribution to our people yet to this day. When in 1984, when Ontario was celebrating the coming of the United Empire Royalists, the 200th anniversary, Queen Elizabeth II had this chalice made, incorporating a lot of our symbols. The earth in our mythology is seen as a turtle rising from the sea. The otter went down to put mud on its back so things that lived on the earth could survive. On it, the Creator placed the clans, the turtle, the bear, and the wolf. Its branches spread in four directions, the great white roots of peace. It has the crown symbol on it and the cross. The tree was always reaching upward to the sky, and on top of the tree was the guardian spirit, represented by an eagle in our culture. The Americans borrowed that from us. So that was the way the Queen honored our people, because so many of our people volunteered their service at wartime and served in His Majesty King George VI Army. So this year, King Charles III sent another prayer book. This time, you want to take the other one, the smaller one down? So this was a gift from the King to the Mohawk people, King Charles. And this is the prayer book of his great-grandfather, King George V. And that decorates the Chapel Royal at Tyendinaga. It's kept in the bank vault and used on special occasions because somebody might break in there and steal it. So we have to safeguard these royal gifts. But this is a symbol of the enduring affection and military relationship that our people have had with the English king and queens over the centuries. 300 years, over 300 years of military service when there's been conflict. So our people died at Passchendaele, the Hill 70, Vimy Ridge, along with other Canadians that fought there. But they didn't fight as Canadians, they fought as allies of the Crown, and they still do. And so, likewise, in the Second World, our last veteran just died in December last year, Austin Fuller, he was 102. They were on the campaign, and they landed in Sicily in August of 1944, and they had their job was to liberate Rome. Then they went on to Amersfoort in Holland, and he talked to me about the starvation that the Dutch people were experiencing at the hands of the Nazis. Some of them were just barely alive when they got there. They were eating tulip bulbs, and some of them were eating grass and working hard, malnutrition. So this inhumanity has been seen in so many places around the world, and the challenge is for everybody to make it different. We have to polish that chain to remove tarnish so that these problems don't continue. And the challenge is all of our treaty partners, which includes everybody in this room and beyond, to help polish that chain. And so that the future is one that we can be proud of, that we've dealt with others properly. But right now, First Nations are still fighting for safe drinking water, housing. It's overcrowded, where tuberculosis is still breaking out in some of the homes and some of the reserves, where there's a lack of opportunity for education. Now, mind you, there has been a lot of money provided by Canada to educate people, and they're prosperous, they're doing well. We graduated 3 doctors from Queen's University last year. We have accountants, we have nurses. We have a partnership with FNTI and Canada College to train personal support workers and nurses. There are architects, there are engineers, there are truck drivers, there are people who work in factories. There are people that are doing cleaning jobs, but employment is a way to prosperity. In many of the places on reserves, there is no economy of any kind, only a few maybe government jobs. And so there's pressure on those communities for resource development in their area, like the Ring of Fire, for example. Oftentimes, First Nations will intervene because we are also concerned about the preservation of nature. Because if we destroy nature, nature will destroy us. The effects of climate change will become more intensified, and you'll see more violence from them you've already seen. Our people understood the codependency and the interrelationship between everything and nature. Everything that exists for a purpose. So everything that exists is not meant to be consolidated and liquidated into cash and economic wealth. There has to be some. You have to allow nature to function the way it's. I think most of you probably like salmon. Like in British Columbia, the chief said if you cut down too many trees, the river will speed up, and the fish won't be able to swim to regenerate to the spawning grounds. They thought the Indians were crazy. And exactly that's what happened. The water from the off-run went into the rivers at a higher rate, and the rivers did speed up. Then they said, don't be blasting near the river. Well, sometimes great big boulders went down into the river to block the flow of the river, and then the salmon could repopulate. And they always said if you dump all of the poisons into the water, that it will affect the things that live in that water. So our people have been fighting to save forests, they've been fighting to stop pollution for the groundwater. And groundwater is very important for people that live in the rural community because a lot of them still have wells. With climate change, those wells are going dry. The water is becoming polluted, so they have to get drinking water from another source, to bottled water. When the Europeans came, you could drink the water out of every creek and every lake, and it would not make you sick. That is not the way it is today. And when you think in the space of time, all of that has occurred in a relatively short period of time. Our stewardship toward the environment very seriously, as well as our relationships with others. Our ancestors said we will share this land, we will live together in peace, we'll be good neighbors, and we will all prosper from this land that the Creator gave us. And so it's time now to honor that. And so I invite you all to be our treaty partners and to help polish that chain.